Namaskar. We are delighted to inform that as part of Symbiosis Golden Jubilee celebration, Symbiosis Law School Noida, in association with Lex Witness, India's first magazine on legal and corporate affairs, has organized a webinar series titled Knowledge Series on Law and Advocacy. Leap 2 of the series on the topic Natural Justice, Scope and Limitation will be delivered today by Mr. V.K. Garg, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. It is an honor for me to introduce Mr. V.K. Garg. Mr. V.K. Garg did his graduation from Campus Law Center, Delhi University in the year 1990. He started practicing law at the High Court of Delhi in 1991. After becoming advocate on record, let me put on record that he was the first rank holder at the said examination. Mr. V.K. Garg was appointed as the standing counsel for the state of Haryana in the Supreme Court of India. He was designated as senior advocate in the year 2014. His specialization in service, criminal and commercial law. He has also been appointed amicus curiae in several matters having national importance. He has represented numerous corporations and public sector undertakings such as GAIL, NHAI, before various high courts, arbitration proceedings, and the Supreme Court of India. Mr. V.K. Garg has also been involved in philanthropic activities and has worked for the upliftment and benefit of lepers in association with Federation of Leprosy Organization. We welcome you, sir, to the series. We have among us Ms. Mayuri Raghuvanshi, advocate on record, Supreme Court of India, an alumnus of Symbiosis Law School, Pune, and a visiting scholar at Symbiosis Law School, Noida. Today's session would be moderated by Ms. Mayuri. Now I hand over the baton to her to explain the rules of housekeeping to the audience present today. Over to you, Ms. Mayuri.
Thank you, sir. Before I request sir to start the enlightening session, I would like to state on record the rules for today's webinar. I request all the participants that if they have any question while sir is delivering the session, you may kindly put those questions in the quick Q&A box that you can see on your screen, and towards the end I will place them before sir as and when he'll permit me. And if you have any question towards the end of the session, we will also permit you to go live with your question. There is a raise hand icon that you can press if you have a question at the time when we permit questions to go live. With this, I request sir to kindly start the session and enlighten us on the topic natural justice, hope and limitation. Thank you, sir.
Professor Ravangle, Director, Symbiosis Law School, Ms. Mayuri Raghuvanshi, Advocate, the management and officers of Lex Witness, and all the students and other audience who have joined online. I'm really very honored and happy to be amongst all of you with this topic, which is close to my heart, and I believe that it is close to everybody else's heart also. Natural justice, scope and limitation. Natural justice is something which we have been using and we have been knowing as something which is not codified but is available to everybody. But what actually in law natural justice mean, and what are its limitations, and whether it can be applied to any and every situation, or are there any exceptions known and accepted by the courts to this principle? That is something which have been, the courts have been struggling to actually define it with some kind of a definiteness. But yes, natural justice is the common sense justice, if I may say so. These are the principles which are inherently embodied into the consciousness of all men in any orderly society. Rules of natural justice, as all of us know, they are not the codified canons, and no straitjacket formula can be applied to define these principles. However, there are two ways. One is the broad way and the broad sense, or I may call the common man's sense, and other is the technical sense in which natural justice have received their definition. In broad sense, natural justice has been taken to mean, and right from the inception, when I talk about evolution of natural justice, I'll tell you the thoughts which have been accepted by courts in England, right from the 16th as well as 17th century. That in broad sense, natural justice was taken to mean as what is right and what is wrong. Whereas in technical sense, it was often equated with fairness in action. Now, if I may talk of the case law on this, in Cooper versus Wentworth, that was a 1863 case. The natural justice was stated as, if I may quote, even God himself did not pass sentence upon Adam before he was called upon to make his defense. Adam, says God, where art thou? Hast thou not eaten the tree whereof I commanded thee, that thou shouldest not eat? So it is something which is equated with something as high as divine. The Indian Supreme Court in Tulsi Ram Patel in 1985 judgment has traced the very concept of natural justice and observed that natural justice or their corollary are neither new nor were the discovery of English judges. They were recognized in many civilizations over many centuries. Principles of natural justice thus are those rules which have been recognized and accepted as the minimum protection of the rights of individuals against any kind of an arbitrary exercise. Initially, what it was thought that these principles will be adopted only by the judicial or the quasi-judicial authorities. But in later years, this concept, as it evolved, it has been applied and it was accepted as correct that even the administrative authorities and in their administrative dispensation, they are bound by these principles. Now, when I spoke about Tulsi Ram Patel and the observation by the Supreme Court of India that this principle is not a discovery by English judges, but was very much known to all, then I may remind you of one incident, one adjudication by a panchayat. If all of you who had joined the previous lecture in this series by Chief Justice Pradeep Nandrajog, Justice Nandrajog had quoted one decision by a panchayat wherein the panchayat had determined a dispute before it, and in that determination the first and the foremost condition was of hearing the person. That is something which is the inherent basic concept of principle of natural justice. That means that you hear somebody before you decide as to what is right and what is wrong. So that was a case which was of 13th century, 13th or 14th century. So I would say that yes, the Supreme Court of India was right in saying so, that it was not the discovery of the English judges or in the common law concepts, but it was inherently known to us too. Now, if we talk of evolution of principle of natural justice, the earliest trace of these principles can be found in 535 AD, when compiler of Corpus Juris of Roman Emperor Justinian used the phrase just naturalis, that is the natural law. So just viewers, just keep the distinction clear in your mind. What I'm talking about is natural law. So far it was known as natural law. Now, the Greeks, they treated it as divine, as something which has come from the God. But many historians believe that perhaps Magna Carta, the great English Charter of Liberties, where for the first time it was provided that sovereign is also subject to the rule of law. That was in 1215. That Magna Carta is the source of natural justice as the principle of law acceptable and applicable to adjudication by quasi-judicial authorities or the judicial authorities or even the administrative authorities. Now, whether it was actually Magna Carta or not, that is a issue which is debatable, because I pointed out that even in India, even before that or even during that period when Magna Carta in England was there, in India, even in panchayat adjudications of dispute, these principles were accepted and these principles were applied. Now, in England, the earliest significant application of principles of natural justice, or in fact, as it was then known, the natural law, can be found in King's Bench decision of 19th May 1760. That was a decision in Moses versus McFarlane. It's a very, very interesting decision, and this decision is also known to have given the world the principle of unjust enrichment. This is the decision which had evolved the principle of unjust enrichment, and which we have now codified in contract law and other laws. There, Chief Justice Mansfield, in his judgment, essentially applied the natural principle of what is right and what is wrong. And he said that you may be correct otherwise, but what actually it is, if I apply this principle, then what the plaintiff was claiming was wrong. So I apply this principle of natural law of what is right and what is wrong, and then hold against the plaintiff. So I'm not taking you to the facts of that case, but this was the first application by a court of law in England of the broad sense of principles of natural justice, namely what is right and what is wrong. Now, courts by and large have taken it to be granted that these principles will receive application to their fullest. But so natural and universal are these principles that they are not confined only to the judicial or the quasi-judicial proceedings, as I told you. In England, as also in rest of the world, they have been accepted to be applicable even to the administrative orders, and sometimes even to the powers or the proceedings created by the contract. Like in Moses' case, Chief Justice Mansfield applied it in a contract case. Though you may say that today the judges may say that no, natural justice will not have any application because the parties are bound by their terms of the contract. But no, the court at that time said that while interpreting the terms of the contract, we will have to see what is right and what is wrong. So now the principle of, I may say, the public policy concept, which we have introduced to attract voidability of a contract, that it is contrary to the public policy in India and all that. So that was applied as back as 1760 by Chief Justice Mansfield. And that's how I say that even in sphere of contract law, these principles were applied. Now, if you read Professor Wade and his writings on principles of natural justice and all, then he has defined these principles in two senses. One is narrow sense and the other, of course, is the broad sense. The narrow sense, the principles of natural justice are taken as mere breach of something and a branch of ultra vires. So it is not taken something new or something innovative or something different, but a mere branch of ultra vires. Now, if that is so, then Professor Wade says that natural justice would be classified as one of the varieties of wrong procedure, or abuse of power which transgresses or the implied conditions presumed to be imposed by the parliament. So that's how we make it ultra vires. However, in broad sense, as the author puts it, is how far it is right for the court of law to try and impart their own standards of justice to the administration. When the power to decide or to take action is vested in administrative body with the very objective of avoiding the forms of legal process, is there a residuum of legal procedure which ought never be shaken off? So these are the broad concepts on which principles of natural justice would be tested. So going by these world over, there are two essentials which have evolved for principles of natural justice, and these are, as all of us know, Nemo judex in causa sua, that is, that no one can be a judge in his own cause. And the second, namely, the principle of audi alterum partem, which means that no one can be condemned unheard. Now, in India, if we see the judgments by the Supreme Court of India, right from 1950 onwards, the judges have evolved one more limb to the principles of natural justice, and that is duty to give reasons. Now, there was a debate as to whether the concept of duty to give reasons is actually part of principles of natural justice or not, and whether it is only a procedural requirement that somebody should give while passing an order must support his or her conclusions with reasons. The court said that no, it is something which is very much traced in the concept of fairness in action, which is, of course, the part of principles of natural justice, and hence is natural justice. So when I come to that topic a little later, I'll tell you that in S.N. Mukherjee's case, the Supreme Court had specifically said that duty to give reasons is part of principles of natural justice. So we in India, we have three essentials, namely that no one can be judged in his own cause, duty to give hearing before decision, and third is duty to give reasons. Now, let us understand what does this first principle and first of the essentials of natural justice, namely this principle of nemo judex in causa sua mean. As I've told you, it literally means that nobody can be a judge because he cannot act a judge and at the same time act as a prosecutor or a party. Nobody can be a suitor at one point of time and a judge later. But this essentially, as the courts have laid down across the globe, is a rule against bias. Now, the rules requiring impartial adjudicators can be traced as back as we can think of. And in India, right from beginning, when we introduced the system of panchas, then, as all of you know, the panchas were, those who have read Munshi Premchand, they must be knowing that panchas were equated with God, something who is next to God. Panchas were treated to be the persons who will adjudicate lists or a dispute between two parties, and they were somebody who were completely disassociated with the dispute or the parties. So in India, in our system of panchayat, in our system of community adjudication, this concept of, first concept of nemo judex in causa sua was very much applied in terms, and this principle of principle against bias, it was very much accepted as a principle that if a judgment is by a person who has some kind of an interest, then that judgment cannot be treated to be a judgment which is fair, just, or doing justice, because doing justice is something which is known in India at least as a divine function which the judges are imparting. Though we can have a debate on that, whether actually it is happening or not. But yes, conceptually, doing justice is a divine function. Now, in England, this theory of having impartial judges, or I may say the rule against bias, it can be traced as back as in 17th century, when in 1610, Chief Justice Coke, in Dr. Bonham's case, went on to say that court can declare an act of the parliament void if it make a man judge in his own cause. This was the first, as I could find, pronouncement by a court of law in England to actually say that even if the parliament there the kind of supremacy of parliament which we understand in India is at, I would say, is a little at a little lower pedestal than it is understood in England. In England, parliament, the supremacy of parliament is considered to be at a much higher level than we understand it. But it was in 1610 that the court had said that no, even if the parliament has made a law and the court finds that the parliament has committed this fundamental mistake of making somebody a judge in his own cause, then the courts, by application of principles of natural justice, gets the power to strike that act of the parliament down as inherently wrong. The decision maker, therefore, should not have any interest, or I should say, should have an avoidable material interest in the outcome of proceedings. Now, the question that will arise at this would be that what does the interest mean? What is that which we will treat as, an interest forbidden? If you read Professor Wade says that if somebody has some direct financial interest in the outcome or not of the proceedings before it, then he is outright disqualified to be a judge. But interest in law, it may take many forms. It may be personal or group interest, as sometimes we say that there is a institutional bias, there is a class bias, there is in service jurisprudence, we often call that there is a cadre bias, that direct recruits are deciding in favor of direct recruits and the promotees are deciding in favor of promotees. So all those kinds of interests, it need not be pecuniary interest. It may be direct, it may be indirect. It may arise from a personal relationship or a relationship in the subject matter, from a relationship with a party which can be direct or indirect at times. It may be apparent, it may be undisclosed, it may entail actual bias, that is predisposition based on fear or favor, affection or ill will. You might have heard these words very often when our ministers take oath, or decide in a particular way rather upon a proper and balanced consideration of facts and law. Now, a vitiating interest may be even non-existent or non-provable by a party, but there may be sufficient appearance of it, either because a reasonable outsider might think that there was a real possibility that the issue could not have been or would not have been fairly determined on merits, or because of undue favor or partiality or antipathy was in the event manifested. Now, there can be, many kinds of interest, many kind of biases which we can think of, but what has baffled jurists is the question as to what is the degree of this bias or interest which will disqualify somebody to be a judge, or can any interest is sufficient to say that no, so and so should not be a judge, or the interest should be defined as this to say that no, this is something which will be prohibited. Now, so there are two, the courts have said, and in England, if we say, since it is a common law concept, so we look up, upon the judgments as rendered by the English courts. In 1866, in R versus Rand, a Queen's Bench decision, it was held that there are cases of automatic disqualification where there is a direct pecuniary or other interest of the judge, as I just now told you. The court said that pecuniary interest, howsoever small, if there is a pecuniary interest, then it is a case of direct disqualification. Now, in other cases, as Professor Wade puts it, which will be the cases of striking down the constitution of a tribunal on the principle, on the ground of bias, or on the principle of violation of first principle of natural justice, would be the real likelihood principle, the real danger principle, reasonable suspicion, real possibility, and even a fair-minded and informed observer test. So these are some kinds of bias which Professor Wade has attempted to define, though in my understanding, and as the author also puts it, bias is something which cannot be exhaustively defined. It has to be determined and tested on case-to-case basis. But yes, if we minutely examine this, then in my understanding as a student of law, Professor Bias has defined them somewhat exhaustively, and almost every kind of bias is covered in one or the other of these. Now, let us take them ad seriatim. Let us take first the test of apparent bias, namely the real likelihood or the reasonable suspicion test. Now, there has been a lot of confusion by concurrent use of differently formulated tests for disqualifying bias. Many judges have laid down and applied the test of real likelihood and held that test for disqualification is whether the facts as assessed by the court give rise to a real likelihood of bias. Now, one of the most famous case on this real likelihood test is the Queen's Bench decision, which I have just now mentioned, in R versus Rand, that is 1866 Queen's Bench decision. But if you talk of Indian context, then the Supreme Court of India, as back as in Rameshwar Bhartiya judgment, Rameshwar Bhartiya versus the state of Assam. Professor Ramanglesh, do I give the reference also for the benefit of the students, if the students may like this?
Please do, sir.
This is AIR 1952, Supreme Court 405. The Supreme Court of India said that the maxim nemo judex in causa sua applies only when the interest attributed is such as to render the case his own cause. Now, so far, this real likelihood test had not come up in, in express words by the Supreme Court of India. But in a little later judgment in Maniklal versus Dr. Premchand Singhvi, AIR 1957 Supreme Court, 4-5, Justice Gajendra Gadkar, as your lordship then was, while dealing with this test of bias against a tribunal, held that it is of essence of judicial decision and judicial administration that judges should be able to act impartially, objectively, and without any bias. In such cases, the court said, now it is important for the students and the viewers to note, in such cases, the test is not whether in fact a bias has affected the judgment. The test always is and must be whether a litigant could reasonably apprehend that a bias attributable to a member of the tribunal might have operated against him and affected the final determination by the tribunal. So the real likelihood test was applied by the Supreme Court of India in Maniklal in 1957. And thereafter, this judgment, of course, shows a little departure from Rameshwar Bhartiya's judgment. But thereafter, if we go a little further and we see in Nageshwar Rao, a 1959 judgment by Justice Subbarao, the court accepted even the principle of reasonable suspicion of bias and equated its effect with the cases of actual bias. The court said that the principles are equally applicable to authorities also, even though they are not courts of justice or judicial tribunals. So even in cases of authorities, the court said in Nageshwar Rao that reasonable suspicion of bias would be sufficient to hold that the decision by such authority, the administrative authority, is vitiated. Now then comes, there are n number of judgments in between, but the most noticeable judgment which all of us have noticed and seen is A.K. Karyapak's judgment. That was a 1969 judgment. The Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court was there dealing with a question where in a case of a selection, a candidate a person who himself was a candidate for selection was also the member of the selection committee. And the plea taken before the Supreme Court was that when the cases of my rivals were being considered, though I was a member of the committee, but I did not participate in the deliberations. So there is no question of bias because the bias is attributed to me and not to the entire selection committee. And others were completely insulated from it. So this plea of bias cannot be taken. The Constitution Bench said that no. It is not necessary in all cases that there should be actual bias. But if there is a reasonable likelihood of bias, then the decision would be vitiated. The Constitution Bench further held that while deciding this question of bias, human probabilities, ordinary course of conduct will have to be taken into consideration. And if it shows and if it gives an impression of bias, then such decision will be held to be as violative of the first principle of natural justice, namely the Numa Judex in Causa Sua. Now, this judgment of the court therefore will show that the court, though did not say apply in actual words, that it also applied the reasonable prudent man test or the impartial observers test, as Professor Wade puts it. But court also applied that, and court said that if somebody looking from outside can say that no, in such circumstances, how can you treat it to be impartial? It has to be treated as partial. And the court applied that test too and said that no, this is bad in law. Now, there are large number of decisions which we can see where reasonable likelihood test has been applied. In S. Parthasarthi versus State of Andhra Pradesh, a 1974 3 Supreme Court cases 459, this test was further qualified to mean that there must be substantial possibility of bias. The court specifically introduced what was just referred and what was just observed as a passing reference in A.K. Karyapak. Here in Parthasarthi, the court specifically introduced the concept of judgment of a reasonable, prudent man. Thereafter, as we see in India, a significant but welcome departure in the concept of bias came in Tulsi Ram Patel in 1985 judgment of the Constitution Bench, where violation of principles of natural justice was treated to be something as arbitrary and hence violative of Article 14 of the Constitution of India. So this concept of bias was interwoven with arbitrariness and hence Article 14 of the Constitution of India. The court said that in such cases, a writ on the ground of arbitrariness would be maintainable and it will be held to be violative of Article 14. Now, if we come to the next test laid by Professor Wade, that is the real danger test. The real danger test was specifically considered in several judgments of the Supreme Court, but if you want to read the best amongst them, then in my understanding, it is Kumayu Vikas, Mandal Vikas Nigam versus Girja Shankar Pant. And if I remember correct, it's a 2001 volume 1 SCC 182 judgment. And if I remember correct, it is a judgment by Justice U.C. Banerjee, wherein the court applied the real danger test and court said, and if I may quote, whether a mere apprehension of bias or there being a real danger of bias, and it is on this score that the surrounding circumstances must and ought to be collated and necessary conclusion be drawn therefrom. In the event, however, the conclusion is otherwise inescapable that there is existence of real danger of bias, the administrative action therefore cannot be sustained. In this case, the court said that even if you are not able to prove that there is a likelihood, you are not able to say that he had some kind of an interest or something, but still, if there is a real danger that if this person decides, then his decision will be colored by the circumstances which are shown. In this case, it was malice in fact. And the plea was that the person, namely the director who was to take decision, he had a mala fide disposition against the petitioner. And therefore, the plea before the court was that even if he has no interest, even if there is no likelihood, but there is a real danger that if this person takes a decision, then it will be a colored decision. It will be a decision which will not be impartial. Because the plea on the other side, the defense was that, look here, no decision has been taken so far. So unless and until you take a decision, and then you question it on the principle of bias, it may be acceptable, but you cannot say that the court should restrain a person on the ground of bias even before he takes a decision. He may take decision which is absolutely impartial, but the Supreme Court, in appeal by the Nigam against the High Court judgment, said that no, there is if it can be conclusively shown that if this person takes a decision, then there is a real danger that it will not be impartial, then it is a case made out, a case of bias is made out. Now, the last as of the list of these tests put by Professor Wade, but not the least, the informed observer test as a test of existence or non-existence of bias was considered by the Supreme Court in Ranjit Thakur versus Union of India, 1987, 4 SCC 182. The court here said that the test of likelihood of bias, for this test, what is relevant is the reasonableness of apprehension in that regard in the mind of the party. The proper approach of the judge is not to look at his own mind and ask himself, howsoever honestly, am I biased? But to look at the mind of the party before him. The test of real likelihood of bias is whether a reasonable person in possession of relevant information would have thought that bias was likely in these circumstances. So the last test, as Professor Wade had put in his list, namely the informed observer test, was applied in this case, and the court said that if a reasonable, prudent person thinks that bias is likely, then it is a case of bias. Though it is a debatable issue as to who can be treated as a reasonable, prudent person and who will not be a reasonable, prudent person in a given case. But we leave that for future determination by the Supreme Court of India. But yes, all these tests of bias have been applied by the Supreme Court, and this first principle of natural justice therefore has been recognized as a sword against all kind of arbitrary, partial court-tainted decisions and exercisable in a court of law. Now, the second essential of the principles of natural justice is the concept of odi alteram partem. That is, no one should be condemned unheard. This principle, in my understanding, it has a very, very sound judicial, jurisprudential basis. And it is also a concept which we can trace in the concept of fairness in action. When fairness of an action is understood in the concept of a determination by a judicial, quasi-judicial, or even an administrative authority, it is, of course, in the context of this principle, is fair hearing. It is because of this reason that the courts have consistently held that procedural fairness must be adhered to, and a party must be given a notice before an action is taken against him. And courts, I'll tell you that the courts have gone even to the extent that if in a dispute between A and B, the outcome of the decision will affect the rights of C, then C should also be pleaded and heard. That, of course, is Prabodh Verma's judgment of 1986, as I remember. But let us see how the courts in England have dealt with this principle of odi alteram partem. In Cooper's case, the court said that there may not be positive words in a statute that the party, before a decision is taken, is to be heard. But still, it will have to be read as something inherent that before a decision is taken in any matter, the person affected or the person in whose favor or against whom a decision is being taken must be heard. Now, there are many judgments by the English courts, and if I start citing and if I start quoting those judgments, then it will take hours and hours, but the list will still may not end. But coming to our Indian context, coming to the Supreme Court of India, the first judgment, if I may quote, is N.B. Khare versus State of Delhi in 1950 judgment by the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court of India, when the court said that this very concept of hearing can be traced into the fundamental rights of a citizen. Here in this case, the court was dealing with an externment order passed against the petitioner. The court said, and the court read the necessity of hearing into the constitutional guarantee and held that it is only fair that an opportunity should be given to a person against whom such order is made to say what he has to say in answer to the allegations against him. There may not be a regular investigation, there may not be a regular hearing, but at least some form of hearing has to be given. That's what the Supreme Court said as back as in 1950. Now, this concept, as I just now mentioned, is considered as essential feature of the concept of fair hearing. If you see D. Smith in his Judicial Review of Administrative Action has said that in administrative law, a prima facie right to prior notice and opportunity to be heard may be excluded by implication. Now, this is something which talks of the exceptions of hearing. So, is it always necessary and in all circumstances it is obligatory that somebody before a decision is taken should be heard? Or there can be some exceptions to this concept? Or can this concept be applied as a rigid concept that no, you will not take any decision, come what may, without putting a person against whom or the person who may be affected by it to notice? No. The courts have consistently held that as against the two essentials of principles of natural justice, this right of hearing has its own exceptions. Now, if I may point out the exclusions, there may be variety of exclusions. There are a number of kinds of exclusions which have been evolved over the years by courts. One of them is statutory exclusion. What happens if a statute explicitly excludes that no hearing will be given? For example, if you see Article 311, Clause 2 of that article, which contains a fair hearing, the right of fair hearing, it contains the exclusion clause also, and that is in Clause 2, and it reads that where the authority empowered to dismiss or remove a civil servant or to reduce him in rank is satisfied, that for some reasons to be recorded by it in writing, it is not reasonably practicable to hold such an inquiry, the inquiry may be dispensed with. So this is one incident which is recognized by the Constitution of India itself, where the right of hearing can be excluded. Now, the scope of this exclusion principle was explained in Tulsi Ram Patel's judgment, and the Supreme Court said, when it was pleaded before the Supreme Court, that no, this cannot be excluded because this is something as natural as the principles of natural justice. The court said that no, the principles of natural justice are not the rigid rules. They cannot be put any straitjacket formula, and they have to yield to and change with the exigencies of different situations. The principles of natural justice will not apply in the same manner in all situations, and hence the court said that no, rule of hearing in a given case for the circumstances recorded can be excluded. In Umrao Singh Chaudhary versus State of Madhya Pradesh, the court, while upholding removal of a vice chancellor of the university by the governor, court said that principles of natural justice do not supplant the law but supplement it. So if the law says that no hearing, so on that ground, and that law is found to be valid and not offensive to the Constitution of India, then for a valid law, the principle of natural justice will have to yield, and they will not be treated as such principles which will supplant the law and say that no matter the legislature says that principles of natural justice will not be applicable, still the principles of natural justice will be applicable. The other exclusions can be prompt action, where some action is to be taken immediately, like the case considered in Maneka Gandhi's judgment, where a passport was revoked, because had the passport not been revoked immediately and had the person been given first notice and all that, the person might have exercised, used the passport and gone out. So the court said that yes, but there if you read that judgment, the court has gone to the extent of saying that if not pre-decisional hearing, at least a post-decisional hearing must be given. So that is a slight expansion of this. But the other exclusions can be legislative functions, prejudice, or useless formality theory. Now, let us understand what is useless formality theory. I will come to prejudice a little later. The concept of useless formality theory was recognized by the courts in England also. And the court said that even in a case of a demonstrable violation of principle of natural justice, namely violation of the principle of audi alteram partem, the courts may refuse relief if the courts in a given circumstance find that even after giving hearing, the result would be the same. So this is how the concept of useless formality theory, namely that giving hearing would have been a useless formality, it was evolved and it has progressed. In India, the most famous case on useless formality theory is Aligarh Muslim University versus Mansoor Ali Khan, that is 2000 volume 7 SCC 529, wherein this theory was applied. But there are critics of this theory, because this theory has its own inherent danger, according to me. And the courts have started recognizing it. Namely, when you say that it would be a useless formality to give hearing, then what the court actually doing is, court is assuming the result by the judicial, quasi-judicial or the administrative authority to happen after the hearing in one particular manner. So in effect, the court is taking away the discretion or the adjudication by that authority, but is accepting an adjudication which the judge deciding the violation of natural justice at that time feels that no, in these circumstances, this should be the decision. As we all know, it is not necessary that on a given fact of circumstance, there can be only one decision. There may be that the authority who has to decide, he may take a different view. And even otherwise, in law, it is his discretion to decide and not the court's discretion today. So the critics of useless formality theory attack this theory principally on this ground, that here the court presupposes or presumes the outcome in a one particular manner. And if you want to read this criticism, then the best which I have found so far is by Lord Ackner in John versus Rees, that is 1969, volume 2, All England Reports, 274, wherein Lord Ackner has said that it is a dangerous theory. Howsoever inconvenient, the principles of natural justice must be followed. Even Craig, in his administrative law, in his work, Craig has said that courts cannot prejudge what is to be decided by the decision-making authority, and therefore the useless formality theory is a theory which is bad in law. Now, coming to the next exception which I pointed out to you is the prejudice theory. If we look as early as in the case of Rich versus Baldwin, the courts had ruled that violation of principle of natural justice is itself a prejudice. And Indian Supreme Court in S.L. Kapoor, I think it is a judgment of 1952, or S.L. Kapoor's case, if I remember correct, the court had followed the same principle and said that if a case of violation of principle of natural justice is made out, then there is no necessity of showing any further prejudice, because it itself is a prejudice. Because natural justice is the concept which is inherent, and if you have violated that, then it is bound to cause prejudice. So the court accepted that theory propounded by Rich versus Baldwin by the House of Lords, and court said that violation itself is a prejudice and no further prejudice is required. Now, but the later judgments have accepted prejudice to the complaining party as a valid exception to violation of principle of natural justice. And one such judgment is State Bank of Patiala versus S.K. Sharma, 1996, 3 SCC 364, where Justice B.P. Jivan Reddy, he drew a distinction between no opportunity and no adequate opportunity. The court said that in first category of cases, namely no opportunity, it will be treated to be a violation, and natural and prejudice is no exception. But in a case of no adequate opportunity, it will be treated as an exception. So it will have to be treated on the touchstone of prejudice. But if we see the Constitution Bench judgment in Managing Director ECIL versus B. Karunakar, which is a 1993 judgment by the Constitution Bench, where the court has laid down the principle of prospective overruling, etc. Most of us have seen that judgment very often. There the court had applied prejudice theory without any exceptions. And the court have said that if a person complains of no hearing, then he must show that a prejudice is caused. In B. Karunakar, the case was of supply or non-supply of the report of the inquiry officer against a person. The plea before the court was that if a person has not been supplied the report of the inquiry officer, then it is a case of violation of principles of natural justice, and hence it will be treated as a case of no hearing or no notice, and therefore it will be bad in law. But the court said that no, it is correct that you must be supplied, but merely because you are not supplied, that is not enough unless you show that by such non-supply of report, a prejudice has been caused to you. And this is how this prejudice theory as an exception to Audi Alteram Partem rule was applied by the Supreme Court. Now, if you see later judgments of the Supreme Court, this prejudice theory has now been elevated, though I have my own reservations against it. But it is the law of the land as the Supreme Court has laid it down. In Alok Kumar's judgment, which is a 2010 volume 5 Supreme Court cases 329, the court has elevated the prejudice theory to de facto prejudice theory. The court has said that no, it is not sufficient that you are able to show prejudice. You must show that prejudice caused to you is a de facto prejudice, that an actual prejudice has been caused to you. So it is not that some kind of a prejudice has been caused to me which is sufficient to claim that no Audi Alteram Partem rule should be applicable, but it should be further qualified and de facto prejudice must be shown. So these are some of the exceptions. Now, one common exception which the students must know is a case where there is an allegation of widespread and pervasive illegality. Like, for example, in a case of mass cheating in an examination. Now, the university takes a decision that we have reports of mass cheating, so we cancel the examination. And so if a challenge is made on the ground that, look here, I am a person who appeared and who had not indulged into cheating. University has not recorded any such finding that I was the person who has also indulged into cheating. So why my paper has been cancelled and why I have not been given any notice before my paper is cancelled? So it is a case of violation of principles of natural justice. The courts dealt with this kind of cases for universities, for recruitment cases, and several other kinds of cases where it has been found that there is a widespread and pervasive illegality, and it is difficult to pinpoint as to who has been beneficiary of that illegality and but who has not been. But yes, the authority come to the conclusion that the illegality has been so widespread that it is difficult to pinpoint the heads. This is also held to be a valid exception to the Audi Alteram Partem rule, and the most famous judgment on the aspect is Bihar School Examination versus Subhash Chandra Sinha, AIR 1970, Supreme Court 1269. In this case, the board, Bihar School Examination Board, had cancelled the result of a particular center on the basis of reports of uses of unfair means, etc. Then some of the students challenged that no, there is no allegation against us that we also indulge into such unfair means, and merely because somebody has committed wrong, then somebody else's sin for the sin of somebody else, I cannot be condemned. And on that basis, it was challenged and said that in any case, before taking such a decision, the university or the board should have given me an opportunity to say and point out that I am not amongst those who had indulged into it. The court said that no. In such cases, we will have to accept this as an exception to the odi alteram partem rule, and the court upheld the decision. Now, another judgment on this specific judgment to the universities and recruitments is Nidhi Kam versus State of MP 2016 judgment. And there are n number of judgments. Apart from this, the other known exception is national security. Then economic policies, which was considered by the Supreme Court in Balco's case, and confidentiality, etc. Now, this is how so far we have seen that of the two essentials, there are no exception to the first, namely the principle of nemo judex in causa sua. But against the second, there are exceptions. But in India, we have the third also, namely the duty to give reasons. Now, if you see this development of law in India, it is very interesting. And Justice S.B. Sinha, in his judgment in Rajesh Kumar versus CIT, that is 2007 2 SCC 181, has said that duty to give reason is a judge-made law. But Justice Sinha was, before Justice Sinha, the earlier judgment in S.N. Mukherjee was not cited. And that is why Justice Sinha has said that though it is a judge-made law, but it is doubtful whether it is part of principles of natural justice or not. I'm sorry. But it is correct that the courts, as late as recent judgments, have held that reasons are an important link between the material which is considered by an authority making decision and the conclusions reached. So therefore, the duty to give reasons is imperative, and it is part of principles of natural justice. But in S.N. Mukherjee versus Union of India, which is a case of 1990, Volume 4 SCC 594, the Supreme Court has specifically held that duty to give reasons is part of principles of natural justice. It is the third essential of principles of natural justice, besides nemo judex in causa sua and odi alteram partem. The same view was reiterated by the court in Kranti Associates versus Masood Ahmad in 2010 judgment, and several other judgments. So what we have seen so far is that of the three essentials, the first, of course, namely the bias principle, is a principle which has to be followed in all circumstances without any exception. Whereas for the remaining two, namely odi alteram partem and also the duty to give reasons, there are exceptions. I have not told you about duty to give reasons principle, exceptions to duty to give reasons principle, but the courts have said that it is not necessary in every case that elaborate reasons must be given. Reasons can be howsoever small. Reasons can be read in the material if the court, if the authority is able to show that there was sufficient material before it. All those set of cases. But for audio alteram partem, we have recognized world over, the exceptions have been recognized. Given all these, in spite of all these, principles of natural justice, as all of us know, is the golden thread in every jurisprudence. It is a protection in favor of have-nots against those who wield, who exercise all powers. They have this right that at least their cases, their disputes, their rights will be adjudicated by an impartial authority, be it judicial, quasi-judicial or administrative. And as Maneka Gandhi had said, they will have to be given some kind of hearing, if not pre-decisional, if not at the time of taking decision, but at least post-decisional. So these principles, my friends, are the principles which are all quoted. These are some of the contours of these principles, some of the some kind of an scope which in this limited time I could share with you, and the limitations of these principles. So while reading these principles, please read them with this understanding that we must clearly identify as to which of the essential of these principles we are talking. And if we are talking about A, then no exception. If we are talking about B, then these are exceptions. And if we are talking about C, then this is the limitation. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ravangli. Thank you so very much, Lex Witness, for giving me this opportunity of sharing my thoughts with all of you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we still have, we'll still request some more time because there are some couple of questions that have come. If, with your permission.
I have a live question request. Can I put up the live question first, ma'am?
So would you like to take the live question first?
As you please, ma'am. It is your
Thank you, Mr. Bhatt. Ms. Sangya Negi, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question live? Ms. Sangya Negi.
Good afternoon, sir.
Very good afternoon, ma'am. Yes, tell me.
So thank you for the enlightening lecture, sir. So my question is that what, as per you, is the most common mistakes which lawyers make with respect to formulating arguments qua the principles of natural justice in court, sir?
Ms. Negi, as you have heard me in my conclusion remarks, the most common mistake which we make is about the identification of violation. We have to identify the violation, whether it is a violation of first essential or the second essential or the third. If it is a violation of first essential, then there is no exception. Namely that there has to be the impartiality and it has to be insulated from bias, etc. But if it is a case of violation of second principle, that is audio alteram partem, then there are exceptions. So whether you can make out a case of violation which has no exception or no such exception affect your case, then while drafting, while arguing your case, you should always keep this in mind, that which degree of violation you are attacking.
Thank you so much, sir.
Tanushka, please unmute yourself and ask a question live. Ms. Anushka.
Good afternoon, sir.
Very good afternoon.
Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us with all this knowledge. Sir, I'm a first year learner from SLS Noida BA LLB.
Oh, most welcome, ma'am.
Yes, sir. So, sir, I did not understand the difference between prejudice and de facto prejudice that you said, sir. If you could please elaborate on it, I
Yes.
would be very grateful to you.
See, if you see the theory of prejudice, which the court had propounded as an exception to the principles of natural justice, was that when I say that since you have not given me hearing, then a prejudice has been caused to me, and I put it on the degree of Rees versus Baldwin, namely that since you have violated my right of hearing, so it itself is a prejudice. That is one case. Or supposingly I say, if you would have given me this report, or if you have given me this notice, I would have said so, I would have explained myself, I would have shown you something. So a prejudice has been caused. But the court, in later judgment, as I told you in Alok Kumar for the first time, court said that prejudice is not to be the prejudice alone. It has to be de facto prejudice, namely that because of non-hearing, because of no notice, an injury has been caused to you. Had this notice been given to you, had this hearing been given to you, then you could have avoided that injury, or you could have explained or set up and show something that, look, this is the law, this is the fact, this is the evidence which I say and I show for you to decide that your decision is wrong, and you could have decided otherwise. So that kind of a de facto prejudice, the Supreme Court said in Alok Kumar, is required to be shown. Like I gave you the example of non-supply of inquiry report. If I have participated, and if I made a representation to the disciplinary authority wherein I quote that this is what has been held against me, and I have come to know, so merely because that the report has not been supplied to me, though that is a violation, that is an irregularity, but it will not be treated as an illegality, because there is a difference between irregularity and illegality. And unless and until it is an illegality, it will not be vitiated. So I will have to show that, look here, I have not been given this report, I am not aware of it, so I am incapacitated to make a representation because I know nothing about it. So this has caused a de facto prejudice in the sense that I cannot make a representation unless I know what the inquiry officer has held against me. But if I, in my representation, or if on the basis of material it can be shown that yes, I am aware as to what has been held against me, or I can make out as to what has been held against me, then it is only a case of prejudice and not a case of de facto prejudice.
Sir, if you permit, I may place before you the questions that
Sorry,
have
Ms.
come in the
Mayuri,
chat
can we
box.
take another live
Yes,
question?
ma'am, you can
There is
make
another live.
I'm really sorry, but let me take up a live question. I'll come back to you
No,
for the
not a
question.
problem. Not a problem. Sir,
Thank
if
you.
sir permits.
Shwetank Neelam, can you please unmute yourself and ask a question live?
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I wanted to ask a question that if the legislature is specifically trying to exclude a particular principle of natural justice, then can such a legislation be challenged on ground of violation of any of the fundamental rights if such a principle has been read into such fundamental right?
See, the courts have recognized legislative enactment as a valid exception. But the first and the foremost consideration while accepting this as a valid exception is that the enactment must pass the test of constitutionality. If the enactment is held to be constitutional or a valid law, then merely because it has excluded hearing, or it has said that no notice will be required or no notice will be, like you there are some kind of cases where in Maneka Gandhi, you take for example, in Passport Act, the authority revoked the passport, and the Passport Act had this provision where this kind of an exception was made. The plea before the Supreme Court was that no, this cannot be done because this affects my fundamental right, because principles of natural justice have been read into the fundamental rights of the citizen. The court said that yes, we accept, but it is not that hearing cannot be excluded. But then the court devised a formula, and the court said that in all such cases where hearing has been excluded, it is not possible, and the authority is able to show that it is not possible or practicable to give a pre-decisional hearing, then at least a hearing post-decision should be given. So that is one judgment in Maneka Gandhi where the court have said, while accepting this as a principle that yes, statute can exclude, the court has said that some kind of a hearing must be given. But as I told you, it is by now settled that the legislature by legislative enactment can exclude right of hearing.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. That was totally clarified.
Over to you, Ms. Mayuri.
Thank you, sir. Sir, with your permission, may I place before you the questions that have come in the chat box?
Yes, ma'am, please do.
So there are a couple of questions. The first one being by Madam Meera Matthew. She's asking that, sir, as stated by you, natural justice has been defined by various jurists in various ages. My question is, don't you think with catena of judicial decisions, the meaning is getting expanded and at times creates conflicts? Why can't we have a conclusive definition? Then usage of further terms like reasonableness, legitimate interest, proximity, etc. Don't you think with different tests created in testing, if violation of natural justice happened, it creates more confusion than clarity?
See, as I understand, your question has two parts. One, that whether the definition of natural justice should be codified. As a student of law, as I see it, natural justice, as all of us know, are uncodified laws. They are taken as I told you right from beginning, they are taken as the law which naturally flows, which are in the conscience of a man and woman. But as a student of law, it will be my earnest desire that they should not be codified. Because if the legislature codifies them, then they will be, shackled in a set of language, in a set of phrases. Whereas today, natural justice as the concept has evolved, because natural justice is a concept and it has evolved from the times when the man has started regulating itself, its living by some kind of rule, some kind of principles, some kind of law. So if we today codify them, then there are inherent dangers in it, namely that it will have much more and many more limitations than we have seen now. Now coming to the second part of it, if to introduce many more concepts and to read all these concepts into natural justice, you will have to go within the three principles, namely, first, the rule against bias, secondly, the rule against denial of hearing, and third, as in India we know, the rule against non-giving reasons. So all these in one form or the other will have to be translated in these three, because the law as it has evolved has seen that these are the three essentials of natural justice.
So the next question is another take on the same issue. This is from an anonymous attendee, and the question is that with the number of petitions piled up and questioning on prejudice and arbitrariness on each and every stage of proceedings, don't you think it's time for Supreme Court to impose penalty for unwanted delay that it causes?
as it is the judges, please don't, my request to the viewer would be that please do not ask for many more restrictions. We are in an age where the personal liberties, the fundamental rights of the people are held to be supreme, and they should be held to be supreme. If we start putting these restrictions as it is, judges have become, very, very touchy about it because of the exploding dockets in courts. And we should not try to introduce many more restrictions. That would be my request to you.
Thank you, sir. So there is the next question is from a learner from our college, Miss Akanksha Rathore. She says that she wants to ask that justice is prefixed with natural. This natural is not a word, it's a term having wide impact in justice delivery system. So she asks that what is the genesis of this term natural? Is it human conscious or the law of nature?
See, it is, I would say, it is something which comes naturally, which you find or which you trace naturally in a society governed by a rule of law. In the very beginning, I had said that these are the principles which are inherently embedded in the conscience of all men. When I say men, then please, I'm not talking gender specific. So these are the principles which are embedded in the conscience of all who are governed, who live in an orderly society. So to say that they are law of nature would be something extremely you can say extremely broad and wide. But yes, these are the principles without which there cannot be any orderly society. So that is why they are called natural justice principles. And this concept and this terminology as natural justice, it came much later. It came in 16th and century, early 17th century. But earlier, as I had mentioned in the earlier part of my talk, they were known as natural law, right? They were not known as natural justice. So this justice concept itself has broadened their scope and ambit to a large extent.
Sir, thank you. The next question, sir, is that whether the principles of natural justice will be attracted in a case where a judge comments on allegations made against him while passing a judicial order.
I don't know what to say, but yes, it can be that strict observant of this principle may say that it should be somebody else who should determine as to what is said about the judge is right or wrong, or whether it is it is in the realm of contempt or not. But it depends on the kind of comment, and as we have seen.
So you,
There are cases where there is contempt in the face of the court, and the court has power to punish people for contempt in such cases. And there, in some of the cases, this plea has been taken that I have committed contempt of you as the judge, and you only are deciding as to whether I have committed contempt or not. So it is violation of the first principle itself. But the courts have held that no, the contempt is not of the judge, but of the court. And the court is certainly different from the judge. Judge is a person, whereas court is an institution. So the principle of contempt has to be seen in the context of an institution. So as I understand the question, this question goes a little on the concept of contempt. So that's why I answered it with this specific example of contempt.
yes. So may I ask Akshay sir, do we have more time to take more questions?
I don't have any other live question requests as of now, ma'am.
So I think we have taken longer than we had requested that we would take your time. And you have been very kind enough, sir, to grant us an extension. So may I, sir, thank you very much for such an enlightening session, and may I request Dr. Ravandle, sir, to please say the vote of thanks now.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And before I just bring out what I learned out of the session today after hearing to you, sir, because, well, there was a question that justice is prefixed with natural. I, of course, would respond to that in the remarks. But yes, the way you cited it and you presented and you draw your ideas or expressions from different jurisdiction, you collated and presented them as part of it. That shows the study on your part and application of those studies as well. But there is like, and this reminds, this entire discussion today, it reminded me of a story which we all have been told, that there are two fighting cats and who are encountered by a monkey. That story I will cite at the end. Before that, it reminds us of the big names, like big names means who made difference, not by their words, but by their acts. And what's such name which comes from the judiciary? Because we have such a rich heritage. And the name comes that of Ram Shastri Prabhune. Ram Shastri Prabhune was known for standing even against the king. So there is that famous trial wherein he convicted the Peshwa for the murder, which was assassination of the present Peshwa by his uncle Raghunath Rao. Madhav Rao was killed by Raghunath Rao. And the ones who believe that when it comes to the law of evidence, people always focus on the story that of the killing of a mockingbird. But I think people have to learn from this famous case wherein the change in a word leads and changes the character of action. So dha to ma. So instead of dharave means to arrest, was turned into marave. Marave means to kill. Now what this talks to us, it talks about the fairness. if there is the fairness, then we stand for what we call as justice. And when we talk about justice, the ones who administer, it is said that they must have this value system, but that is not only the judge, but even each and everyone who is part of the system, which stands for justice. There is a famous shlok which I would like to talk or cite here, which talks about the character that the system requires. I quote, Videsheshu dhanam vidya, vyasaneshu dhanam matiha, paraloke dhanam dharmaha, shilam sarvatra vai dhanam. It says, knowledge, vidya is the real wealth in a foreign land. So is cleverness at tough times. Righteousness, that is dharma, is the only wealth that can buy heaven, that is parlok. Verify good conduct, that is shil, is the wealth everywhere and not all the times. So the two principles, one shall not be the judge in his or her own case, and nobody shall be condemned unheard. They stand for this. They stand for righteousness. They stand for the good conduct. And they stand for what other may use, knowledge, but that too cleverly. So one has to be very careful, and we have come across such trials like Rajananda Kumar trial, wherein one was wrongfully convicted, was condemned, and everybody remembers that they changed the whole direction of the freedom movement as well, if people follow that. If one refers even to the famous dialogue or the reaction or the response of Lokmanya Tilak and Mahatma Gandhi to the law, that is the British rule. When Lokmanya Tilak, and of course everybody knows both have had the backing of law. So when Lokmanya Tilak was tried, he said, let me not just contest, but defeat them by their own rules. And when it comes to Mahatma Gandhi, he said, I'm not bound because this is not the rule of the land. So if you see that both were carrying that righteousness, and they specifically identified then as well, and they made it clear, when it comes to administration of justice, these two principles are the cardinal principles. And accordingly, they proved it. So when we were talking about Rajananda Kumar or Ram Shastri Prabhune, and the question which was asked about whether it is value or it is a value system. Well, everything that we are part of is a system, but it is governed by values. And those values come naturally. So that's why the term natural is, because we naturally exist, we naturally cohabit. Law is made by us to govern for ourselves. So naturally, justice follows in case there is injustice. And it is also very well said by another shlok, which reads, Na uchartho vipilopi, dushanam padam dushyatatum, kamo laguha. There is no fault in the failure of the big dream or aims, but it's big fault even to think for the personal selfish gains. There was a question that one before whom the matter is, and it is reference to that, then what is required of the person. We have been taught and we have been learning that see the person not holding the seat, see the seat and argue. And sometimes we see nowadays, people have forgotten these very basic tenets. We see the person, we don't see the knowledge. We see the seat, but we don't see what it is meant to administer. And I hope people on both the sides would learn that, and then there would be what is called as administration of justice. So when I talked about the story of two fighting cats and a monkey, well, of course, this dates me back to my school days, and this was told to me by our Guruji, that first cat says, I saw it, so it's mine. Other cat says, I am having it first, so it's mine. And then came the monkey on the scene. Hey, do not fight. I'm here to provide to whom it does belong, and everyone knows the story. The monkey promised that yes, I'll break it even and I'll give you your equal share. End of the day, both got nothing. Monkey got everything. So we also have to understand whether we would like to become cat, whether we would like to become a monkey in the given case, if we do not believe in the principles of natural justice. And which you rightfully said, sir, that the principles principles are the same, their application is changing. Times change. Does their application change? Expectations of people are changing. Nowadays, people say that we have passed from retribution till reformation. No, we have gone back to retribution. When you see the approach of everyone, everybody says no. One who does not care for the other, please teach a lesson. So it's a circle. So we cannot say it's a vicious circle. We have to say it's a circle. And we are the pivot around which this circle is revolving. So whether we call it a justice circle, whether we call it as a fair circle, or whether we say it's a life circle, end of the day, we are constant in this. Everything just revolves around us. So let us see what we would like to see. But end of the day, justice is not said to be done. It is seen to be done. And which makes it are the principles of the natural justice. And thank you very much, sir, the way you explained it too. And the corroborations you gave with the form of the judgments, the statements of the famous worshippers of words of wisdom, who not only tell those terms or they make the statements, but they have lived by those statements. And that's why it becomes most important. And accordingly, that makes today's topic not just relevant for the time, but for the times to come, because we keep living and we may leave one day, but others will get in and they will keep living, because these principles need to be cherished forever, because they make our life what it is, a real life. So thank you very much, sir. I really enjoyed. And I always say that every speaker who comes, they always take us back the memory lane, and it reminds us of those virtues which were given to us by our Gurujis, then our grandparents, then by our parents, by the students we are in the midst of whom are learning as well. And today's session was another fantastic session, and it gave me a good learning. Thank you very much. And it is a thank you to Madam Mayuri as well, that I always say that it is good to be a proud teacher of students, and that she introduced me to your good self, sir. And I have learned
very much.
Yes, sir. I have learned a lot from Miss Mayuri as well. She was my student colleague. Now is a colleague at the law school, and credit goes to her. Thank you very much, Miss Mayuri. And thank you very much to Mr. Akshay. He always has been so supportive of all these knowledge series, whose whole object is to just spread the awareness about the information one or the other person carries. One may turn it into a knowledge using his or her capability. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Professor Ravandle. Thank you so much, Mr. Garg, Ms. Mayuri.
Thank you, Akshayji.
Thank you. Thank you.
Most welcome. Professor Ravandle, seeking your permission to end the webinar for everybody.
Yes, Mr. Akshay. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.